I'm obviously a shill for big deuterium.
Hi, this is Tucker Goodrich, and I have the honor today to be joined by Professor John Speakman, who is a professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Shenzhen, China, and at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He is a world-renowned expert on the topic of energy balance, with a particular interest in what's known as doubly labeled water. And I believe it's correct to say you run the world doubly labeled water database, which is the topic of the paper that we're going to be discussing today in part.
Yeah, right. So there's not many people use this technique, and a few years ago they came together and decided that we would pool all the data that we had into a big database.
Deuterium and chronic disease. And you're also an expert in the effects of deuterium on, or using deuterium to measure these processes. Now,
Sure.
there's a hypothesis going around that deuterium is what is driving, let's just say the simple deuterium is driving chronic disease. And that, I've looked into this a little bit and, you know, A, like a lot of these things, there's a natural level of deuterium in the environment, just like there's, a historic level of fat in our diet. And it seems that, if you get too little deuterium or too much deuterium away from the natural level, that you start seeing positive and negative effects on organisms. So it's an interesting hypothesis. Have you seen, but you've been spending quite a lot of time pumping substantial amounts of deuterium into these organisms, including people. Do do you think that there's anything to this hypothesis? And if not, why not? And if so, why?
Well, okay. So I mean, I saw all the stuff, and obviously we're using deuterium, like you said, and we're putting quite a bit of deuterium into people. So I was really interested in whether that was having negative effects, and also uh, what influence that kind of hypothesized physiology might be having on the technique. Is that affecting how accurate the technique is? Does that explain some of the individual variability and the validation studies of the technique? So I did look into this in some detail, and my conclusion is that it's a, to be honest, it's not. It just doesn't hang together in any way as a story. So I can sort of
And
uh,
yeah,
so,
why?
so
Can you elaborate a little bit on why?
yeah. So I mean, if you look at the document that was produced by that guy Laszlo Boris, who's the main guy who's driving this, what he says is so he's talking about the dangers of changes in natural abundance of deuterium in compounds. And so what he says is that if you take a fatty acid, for example, that has got these levels of deuterium in it, then that can create a problem because when the fatty acid is oxidized, and those hydrogens appear in water. And what he says is that if you have a deuterated water molecule, that somehow destroys the metabolic nanomotor in the mitochondria. So I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that that happens. But let's just imagine that that's true. That if you have uh, a deuterated water molecule, then that has some negative effect in the mitochondria.
So what he's
So what
saying essentially is, just for the audience here, he's saying that complex 5, which is basically a little
ATP
rotary.
synthase? Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it looks like a little rotary engine, and it
yeah,
produces the ATP that we all understand is the energy currency of the cell. And he's
yeah.
claiming, and clearly breaking that is a bad thing. So he's got that. But
Right. So I think the first thing is there's no evidence that deuterated water molecules break that motor. So
Okay.
I think that's I couldn't find anything anyway. So that's a kind of an assumption that's been made. But let's give him that. Let's assume that's correct. Okay. So what you have to just think about is the quantification of these effects. So basically, the background level of deuterium is 155 ppm,
Parts per million.
very, very low. Okay. And he says that some fatty acids may be enriched by a factor of 4 in the levels of deuterium. So in other words, instead of
Is there
150,
is there any evidence that that happens?
I couldn't find anything for that either.
Okay.
But there was some evidence in an amino acid, so in a really unusual situation. So some people looked at uh, deuteration of amino acids in collagen extracted from seals. And what they found was, for some reason, and I think it is pretty interesting biology, I have no idea how it happens, but for some reason, proline had 4 times the background abundance of deuterium.
Okay. Which tells us that maybe seals concentrate deuterium and proline for some reason we don't yet understand.
That's
Fine.
right, which is
Feasible.
interesting. Which
Yeah,
is
it's interesting.
interesting. But what he then says is, well, let's imagine that these fatty acids that are being eaten in modern society are also deuterated to the same extent. So they're 4 times higher than uh, than the background level. And I don't think there's a shred of evidence to support that. But let's also go with that and see what that means. So if you just work through the numbers, you can imagine what this is. So if you think about a background level of 155 ppm, what that means is if you take a fatty acid like stearic acid, then what that means is for every 170 molecules you have, one of them in one location will carry a deuterium molecule. Okay? Whereas if it's 4 times higher, that means 4 out of 170 will have a deuterium molecule. So the vast majority of molecules are not carrying a deuterium. And even within those molecules, the majority of hydrogens are not deuterium.
Right.
So then wind it forwards and say, okay, what happens if we oxidize one of those fatty acids? If we imagine that actually the fatty acid is at the regular background level of 155, then when it's oxidized, what that means is that 1 out of 6,000 water molecules that come from that oxidation process carries a deuterium. Okay? Whereas if it's 4 times higher, it's 1 out of 1,200. But if you think about it in terms of percentages, what we're saying is that if you oxidize a fatty acid at natural abundance, then 99.98% of the water that comes from that is undeuteriated.
Well, and the
Whereas
implication of this would, if his hypothesis is correct, is that the body would have to be incredibly sensitive to small increases in the amount of
yeah,
deuterium in
so
the body.
the increase is just unbelievably small. So you're going from 99.98% being undeuteriated to 99.94% being
Right.
undeuteriated. So that
So,
change, even if we give him that, there's a fourfold higher level in the fatty acids, which there's no evidence for, and the idea that a deuterated water molecule kills the nanomotor, which there's no evidence for, even if you accept those things, the magnitude of the difference is so small, it's just completely not going to be of any physiological importance.
But if it was, and if he's right, then a bunch of scientists who are running around pumping organisms full of deuterium over the course of a number of decades might notice something.
Yeah, right. So I
So,
mean, I'm obviously a shill for big deuterium here because I don't want there to be any effect of deuterium going on. But I mean, I think realistically it's not happening, and there's a test that you can make for it. So I mean, he claims that all these changes actually uh, in the deuterium level are actually having a negative effect on cancer rates and stuff like that. So the interesting thing is that what happens with the natural abundance level of deuterium is it's not fixed. So the reason that it's not fixed is that when you evaporate water, the activation energy to evaporate water is greater for deuterium than it is for uh, water with just two protons on it.
so
So the
evaporation
consequence,
is a distillation process then.
yeah, right. So what it does is it enriches the amount of deuterated water. So because if you look across the planet, and this has been known since the 1970s, that if you look across the planet, the natural abundance of deuterium is much higher in the tropics than it is at the poles.
And that's
So what
because
would
water tends to evaporate from the tropics and then flow north and precipitate
right,
out with lower deuterium levels.
right. So that global cycle and the amount of evaporation that's happening in the tropics means that people in the tropics have much higher natural abundance than people living at higher latitudes in both directions. So if its idea is correct, that you get a protection because of low deuterium levels, then what you would predict is rates of cancer would go down with increasing latitude.
And obesity and heart disease and all the
Yes,
other chronic diseases,
and they don't.
they go up.
So obesity, there's no difference. But cancer, so I looked at a couple of papers on links between latitude and cancer rates just to kind of check it out. And prostate cancer in North America increases with higher latitudes, and breast cancer in Australia increases as you go further south. So in both those cases, it's the opposite direction. Obviously, for lots of other reasons that influence cancer rates, but the deuterium effect is not a dominant signal if it's there at all. So I come to the conclusion that this is really not something serious, and we shouldn't be particularly worried about uh, taking doubly leveled water because I've done it myself a couple of times.
Right. And I mean, yeah, when I first heard this, my immediate reaction was, okay, what's the process by which this is getting so enriched? And I have, as you said, I also haven't been able to find any explanation for how it's happening or a quantification that it is
But
happening. I did find some interesting papers. I mean, there is definitely an area in cancer research looking at deuterium depleted water because it stimulates oxidative stress on the cells, and there's a whole range of different therapies that are used against cancer that increase oxidative stress. But the flip side of that is they've looked into deuterated lipids, specifically like linoleic acid, the PUFAs that are subject, and DHA, the PUFAs that are subject to oxidative damage, and thereby induce oxidative stress. And what they find is that the deuterated PUFAs induce less oxidative stress because they're less chemically active, which is,
right,
there's a lot of evidence, which we won't go into here, that oxidative stress is a factor in all these chronic diseases. And if this deuterium hypothesis is correct, then a simple test of deuterating polyunsaturates and feeding it to organisms should produce bad outcomes. But what it seems to do, and there's not a lot of data, but what it seems to do is reduce the bad outcomes. So the exact, again, reverse of the
yeah. But
hypothesis that they're
again,
proposing.
you just got to think about this numerically as well as just kind of practically. So when you give a deuterated an artificially produced deuterated molecule, all of the hydrogens are deuterium. So we're not talking about one molecule in 170 stearate molecules. We're talking every single carbon in every single molecule is
You mean
deuterium.
every single hydrogen?
Every single
Right.
hydrogen, sorry, in every molecule of stearate is a deuterium. And that's why you get some physiological effects at those levels. But that's, like it's like literally several 100,000 times more deuterium than the signal that we see in the environment.
Right. And a similar amount more than his proposal of a fourfold enrichment.
Yeah, right. So this is like a 400,000 fold enrichment.
Right. And it's beneficial. I mean,
Right. Okay. So it goes in the wrong direction anyway.
yeah.
But I mean, it's not you can't compare those things. So he sort of said, if you look at the phase transition between deuterated and undeturated molecules, there's a big physiological effect. Well, of course there is, but you never ever see molecules in nature that are completely deuterated. These are completely artificial compounds.
Right. 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 Okay, well, that's good. So we can stop worrying about that one. If we had,
I mean,
obviously, both
actually,
of
I was
us.
I was glad he brought it up because it's like something to worry about when you use these techniques, but it's good that it turns out it's probably not important.
Well, especially if, yeah, if it's bollocksing up the results of your experiments, I'm sure you were not. I mean, that's why you would take it seriously. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.